بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I'm so, honored and happy to be with you all at this wonderful convention. MashaAllah, you guys call it a festival. And I have a short time. I just got off a flight from Chicago last night, and I'm here with you from the United States, joining you from our center, Khalil Center. We're the largest provider of Muslim mental health services in the continent, in North America. We have various different offices. And what I focus on is mental health. I focus on Islamic psychology and the intersection between spirituality and psychology. And I wanted to just address today this notion of resilience, this notion of psychological well-being that has been a topic of interest of clinical psychologists and the broader field of psychology very recently for the past 10 to 20 years. This has been a growing area of interest. And I want to sort of intersect that with Islamic principles and values, inshallah, for us to take some things away. First of all, just to start, where I'm coming from, the United States, and I'm not sure that it's necessarily the case here, so forgive my generalizations or extension of my generalizations of what happens in the United States here into the British context. But I can pretty well bet that it's very similar in that while the United States is the most economically and technologically advanced country and civilization that the world has ever seen, and as a whole, the Western world, we also find that they are among the saddest and most anxious people in the world. And this piques our curiosity and interest as to how this could be. Because one of the theories that the Freudians, Sigmund Freud, for example, later on his followers actually had some traction in the United States, and they attempted to influence policy and politics. One of whom was Wilhelm Reich. In the 1950s, he was a follower of the Freudian idea of if you could create a society in which you remove the social judgments that people have of you, and you can create an overly permissive society in which your repressed inner conflicts can be expressed without shame, then you'll have a happier society. And in fact, he was among one of the leading figures that was widely accepted in the United States while he was rejected in Europe. He found much reception in the United States for this idea. And his followers, and then you had the Kinsey studies and various things to follow. And what they led was what you call the sexual revolution. And this is actually where we are today, a society that is overly and highly permissive. Now psychologists have come back to say, hey, there's something wrong with this arrangement, that individuals seem not all too happy. In fact, we have so much depression in the United States that we have depression found in, or antidepressants, traces of it found in the water supply. Meaning that's how widespread antidepressants are. And they have started to open up this conversation that there's two kinds of pleasure and happiness. There's hedonic or hedonistic pleasure, instant gratification. And what's very interesting about this is that the Prophet ﷺ actually talks about this. And he says, "Al-ajizu man atba'a nafsahu hawa wa tamanna 'ala Allah al-amaniya." The person who is shackled, the person who is disabled and dysfunctional. Very interesting, the word is ajiz, disabled and dysfunctional, is the individual who makes his nafs, his lower carnal desire, his lower self, his self, follow their passions and their hedonistic drives and desires. Very interesting. The Prophet ﷺ took a Sahaba and he drew two lines in the sand. And some scholars have extrapolated and they've drawn a box as well. And then they show a line that goes through the box that says, this is the ajal, this is the box is the limits of human life, while the nafs and its desires exceeds it. So you'll never actually reach complete satisfaction. So what is it that you should do then? Well, I think we need to look at our Islamic tradition and look at what some of the research says. The other side of the coin of this is that psychologists are starting to say that there's eudemic contentment, eudemic pleasure and happiness. And that might actually be the secret to unlocking the human potential. And what's associated with that is high levels of contentment. And what's interesting is that rather than consumption, rather than what we call now in modern psychology self-care, very popular now, right? Self-care. And I'm not saying you shouldn't take care of yourself. Inna nafsa alayku haqqun. The Prophet ﷺ says that your body, yourself, has a right over you, but we've taken this way too far. In fact, what the Islamic tradition suggests and what modern scholars in positive psychology suggest is that what's the key to relational and psychological satisfaction is other care. You can serve yourself through serving others. And the Prophet ﷺ says this, وَاللَّهُ فِي يَعُونِ الْعَبْدِ مَا كَانَ الْعَبْدُ فِي يَعُونِ أَخِيهِ. That Allah will be in the service of the individual, will assist them as long as he is in the assistance of other individuals. And so what are the correlates of what they're calling contentment or eudemic pleasure and contentment? Well, I'll tell you this. You know, we talk a lot about resilience and psychological trauma and stress, right? How do you develop resilient societies? People who will have good relationships, people who will be able to withstand difficulties and challenges in their lives. Isn't that all what we want for our children, for ourselves, for our families? That's what people are after. Well, psychologists have found that there's this continuum, meaning that when somebody experiences a trauma, what's very interesting is that the vast majority of people, about 64% of the population, or 68% of the population, recovers within a month. That's the normal expression, even if it's a highly traumatic, stimulating situation or evoking situation. But what's very interesting is that 16% of people develop PTSD. They get dysfunctional, they get sick. Now, what's very interesting is what now the positive psychologists are looking at, is there's 16% of individuals who become healthier and more functional after a suffering. Now, need we look beyond the people of Gaza? Allah Ta'ala free them and free Palestine and give afiyah and accept their shuhada? Do we need to look beyond them? Isn't this modern evidence for us of the fact that high levels of faith, caring for others, and a sense of community seems to lead to greater sense of contentment and satisfaction? The Quran says, من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فلنحيينه حياة طيبة. Entrench this into your mind. Hayatan Tayyiba is the equivalent of what we call psychological well-being in the Islamic tradition. Psychological well-being is Hayatan Tayyiba. And the one who does good, strives against their nafs, does good deeds and virtuous actions, meaning serving others, hilm, shukr, ithar, selflessness, which, by the way, are all of the things that modern psychology is finding is associated with high levels of contentment. In fact, if you take, and I'll give you one final example, and I'll close with this, and I invite you to my session on anxiety that we have. We've written a book on this that I have as a breakout session here, I think in the next half an hour, inshallah ta'ala. One of the final things is one of my students, and one of our hypotheses is that marital satisfaction and relational satisfaction is going to come through service to others and other care and the development of self and virtue. So one of the things that the literature finds is that married couples, when you teach them skills, communication skills, right, in the therapy room, they get better. They feel better and their marriage improves, but it's short-lived. It doesn't last long. It's very interesting. After a few months, people revert back to the same problems. But what we do find as the common denominator is that individuals who possess virtues of selflessness, patience, gratitude, giving people benefit of the doubt, seem to have lasting change. And so my takeaway is that psychological well-being is not the absence of dysfunction. People who are not sick are not happy. In fact, quick point, I know I'm a little over my time. The last quick point, after COVID, which I know this conference has taken place well after some time, that after COVID, the University of Chicago found that only 14% of people were reported being happy during COVID. We can expect that, right? People were pretty sad and anxious and whatnot. But what they found is that this was a drop compared to pre-COVID. Only 30% of people were happy. Wow. So pre-COVID, people were happy only at 30% of the time. Does this not signal to us that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that we approach our outlook and societal well-being and the notion of, it doesn't mean that everybody was clinically sick, but what it does indicate to us is that people were not necessarily living well. So my takeaway is that inshallah ta'ala, Allah ta'ala give us the tawfiq and ability to be able to go back to the tradition and to develop the virtues and to focus on the virtues. And it is a science through mentorship and some reading that does need some work. Not all of it comes naturally. But your well-being, psychological well-being, depends on it in this dunya. But the beautiful thing for us is that it's not just a dunyawi thing, but also in the akhirah. Wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.